and you have to give yourself time. This is generational work. And so no one's going to be changing overnight. Structural racism didn't just this is 450 years old. We're not going to solve every single problem tomorrow.
My name is Victoria Sprouse, the podcast producer, and this is the first part of my interview with Andrew Plumley, the former senior editor of Equity and Culture at the American Alliance of Museums and current head of Equity and Impact for Arabella Advisors. Andrew, thank you for making the time in your very busy schedule to talk to us today.
Thanks so much, Victoria. It's really nice to be here.
What are the biggest changes you've seen museums make in response to the socio-political reckoning of 2020?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think there's been plenty of shifts since 2020. When George Floyd was murdered, there was obviously a lot going on in our country, a huge racial reckoning. And I think museums were not left out of that conversation. And one of the things that I saw immediately was that museums, and particularly museum leaders, knew that they had not done enough foundation work before 2020 to actually engage in the conversations that their staff, employees, and their communities were having. And so that was one of the first shifts that I saw from museums and museum leaders, was figuring out, okay, what are the sorts of trainings, what are the sorts of conversations that we need to be having to support the folks that are actually working in the building and to support the conversations that the communities were having. Unfortunately, a little bit too late for that. Once something happens in your community, or once something happens that is obviously, gripping the nation, trying to backtrack and find trainings that probably should have been happening, or having conversations, or doing the actual work around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. You need to have that foundational knowledge to then actually incorporate that into conversations that you're having. But folks were calling, and I'm sure a bunch of DEAI, or diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion practitioners, had plenty of work around that time, because folks were getting called all over the place. I think although those calls seem to be coming a little bit late, the good thing about those shifts were that the work was starting to happen. And so it really was a catalyst for museums to understand, for folks that were, just starting their journey, that this is really important. Unfortunately, things like George Floyd are going to happen again in different sorts of communities. And so museums were realizing that they really needed to start doing that work and start their journey.
So now they've kind of made the changes that need to be made in order to enact change, even in the first place.
Yeah, I think they realize that museums aren't left out of those kind of, as you put it, the socio-political reckonings that were happening. Museums weren't left out of that conversation, and many museums were actually getting called out for not actually being ready to handle those conversations. And a part of that was that they were putting out public statements around they're kind of in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and at the same time, not even supporting many of the Black employees the Black and brown employees that they had in their museums. And so there was a real dissonance in those public statements that happened. And so they knew they needed to do more work. They're starting to do that work now. They're hiring folks that are holding that transformational work of changing organizational culture. And I think another big important shift was that museums externally, the communities that they're a part of, raise the standards and their expectations of what museums need to be. So now the level of accountability for museums is at a much higher standard. And I think that's actually needed. External accountability is a huge piece of DEAI work. And without communities holding folks accountable publicly, and those museums stating publicly what they were going to do, I think that was a huge shift for the field that I hope continues.
Yeah. So speaking of, diversity within museums and being held accountable, The 2017 Museum Board Leadership Report revealed that 46% of museum boards are 100% white, and 93% of art museum directors are white. So can you explain how you see a change at the board level creating change at the staff level, or vice versa if it's happening the other way?
Yeah, I think it can happen both ways. I think that those numbers are profound and frankly shameful. But I think it's also kind of indicative of where the museum field is right now in terms of specifically racial and ethnic diversity, but all sorts of diversity.
It is shameful. It's crazy to think about because diversity is not like a new topic. And so
No,
to find that 46% are 100% white is just, crazy.
it's crazy. And I think it's it's how museums were built. And so that's still, a part of that legacy of many, many of the museums that are across the country. Now, not all, because some museums, that Black and brown led are often created of, by, and for the community. But for the most part, museums are, majority white and absolutely white led. I think one of the important parts about diversifying museum boards specifically is not just because we need to get those numbers to different numbers, but it actually does something to the museum. It allows there to be an expansion of the stories and narratives that we tell. And really, museums are the holders of culture and stories and narrative. And with a more diversified board, particularly racially and ethnically, we're going to get an expansion of what stories we can tell from what perspectives we can tell them. And I also think that if we start to diversify boards specifically, often boards recruit from the same, places, spaces, friend groups, colleague groups that board members know. And as you diversify that, the board will become more diverse, and because it's not going to be such a homogenous group. And so I think that will also lend itself to different sort of leaders moving into museum leadership roles, hiring more diverse, racially and ethnically diverse staff over time. So I think, as the board gets more diverse, so does the staff. It can happen vice versa, and often does, because it's easier often to hire diverse kind of staff level, racially and ethnically diverse staff. And over time, that kind of builds up into senior leadership positions. And then because those museums are maybe more majority Black and brown, it makes sense for those board members to actually identify with the stories that they're telling, and the museum leadership as well. So it can happen both ways, but I do think there's a huge push. There needs to be a huge push for diversifying, particularly museum board leadership.
Right, particularly because, starting at the staff level and moving your way into an executive position can take years and years.
And often the folks
like a
in leadership,
lifetime.
those folks in leadership positions are there for 15, 20, 30 years. So there needs to be, something happening at that level. That's absolutely right.
As museums make an active effort to diversify, what would you say to white colleagues who want to offer support to staff members of color about racial injustices after they occur in their community, but don't know exactly how to proceed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question and a tough one to answer, particularly because I'm not white. But I would say this: the first thing that any person has to do is educate themselves. And I think making sure that your education is rooted in authentic behavior, I think is huge. So, if I'm a white colleague and I don't have an authentic relationship built on trust and vulnerability with any person of color within my museum or workplace, it's probably not a smart idea to just go and have a conversation with that person about what's happening in the world. There's a lot of weight and trauma and harm that's happened to folks of color already. having to support a conversation with a white colleague who has probably never talked to me before or we're not close with isn't a great place to start. I would start with education and talking to your white coworkers about the things that are going on,
Right.
and trying to figure out ways to give more space for folks of color to not have to not feel the responsibility to hold those sorts of conversations in the museum. I think that's a huge thing that every white person can do to be a better ally right now.
And this is, slightly a different context as this is an interview, but maybe, as a white person, not putting it on a person of color to explain to me what I need to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point. And I often
Something I realized as soon as you started talking.
Yeah. I think it's a interesting point because I sometimes say this and I don't mean it to be flippant, but Google is an unbelievable tool. There is no question that hasn't been asked on Google, and particularly for white folks, Google things, because things pop up and you can read and read and read. And now obviously intellectualizing this work and just thinking about it from that intellectual space isn't sustainable, because you have to bring this work from your head to your heart. But I think that is a really great place to start. So Google the things that you don't know.
Yeah. So taking a slightly different perspective on somewhat the same topic, how can arts organizations take a role in our society overcoming the discomfort we are often conditioned to feel, especially in America, when discussing the issue of race, and particularly, in museums, that race can and should be a primary focus of a lot of exhibitions?
Yeah. I think you kind of said the biggest part. In the American context, race is the biggest driver of disparity, often conversation. And so not focusing on it is really not a great strategy moving forward, just in terms of sustainability, in terms of audience.
And the relevancy of your museum.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
cannot just put this over here in one bucket of work and say we'll touch on this once a year. It is
Which
all the
sometimes
time.
is, yeah, what I find at museums, especially smaller local museums, is that a lot of the museum has, different exhibitions that are focused on white history. And then there's like one corner somewhere that talks about, another people's history, when it could be all together. It's the same history. Yeah.
I think that, to me, that's it. And this ties to something that I found really interesting right when I came into the museum field, around just our nomenclature and lexicon about museums. We talk about Black and Brown and other kind of identity specific museums as culturally specific. And when I heard that for the first time, I'm like, what does that actually mean? And I think the whole point is that white in the museum space, in the museum field, we don't see that as a particular culture, but everything
That's just
else
the base,
is
kind of.
right.
Yeah.
That is the standard. And so even the way that we name museums as culturally specific or not, I think does huge damage to really how race is constructed and how white dominant norms and race plays out in many different cultures and many different spaces. And so white is a culture, particularly in the American context, as is everything else. And so art museums that focus on white artists is a culturally specific museum as well. But I think one thing, back to the original question, I think we have to understand that many of us are socialized not to talk about race in public, particularly in multiracial spaces. But one of the things that we have to do if we're going to get better at this is to have spaces where those conversations actually take place in safe and brave spaces. And I think museums and cultural institutions are the perfect places for that. Mostly because of the stories and narratives that they are able to tell, but also because of oftentimes those museums are in community. And once you're in community, you to me, we all have an obligation and a responsibility to hold space, to build relationships, again, built on trust and vulnerability and authenticity, to actually build a better, stronger ecosystem for our community. And I think museums and cultural institutions are those places. So I think it's imperative that we do that. But I think in order to do that, again, museums have to have the foundational knowledge of concepts of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, so that when we do bring people together, we're actually having that in a respectful way, or having those conversations in a respectful way, rather than causing more harm.
I attended a lecture of yours the other day where you said that taking risks and anticipating that you will make mistakes is a crucial aspect of DEAI work. What would you say to organizations that are afraid of doing anything for fear of making a mistake or facing backlash? But also, I do want to keep in mind what you just brought up, the fact that, not doing anything and having a white-centric museum is a choice and not just a standard. Yeah, I think that was a really good point.
Yeah, it absolutely is a choice. And I think I understand how scary it can be to take risks around this work, particularly given 2020 and what's happened and kind of our general move towards cancel culture right now.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't personally heard of any museums being canceled, but that might be because I'm not in the space, but as much, yeah.
Yeah, and I think for many of the museums that did get some backlash for their public comments, those museums are too big to fail, quote unquote. Like they're too big to can't be fully canceled. But I do think that particular leaders, individuals within institutions, feel the pressure, and frankly, are canceled. And to me, I understand why there's fear there. Most of the time, I mean, we could talk about cancel culture for a long time. I think it's a really useful tool in specific instances to really have voices of the unheard be heard. And I think it needs to be a part of any activist or any movement's toolbox. But from the other perspective, from the other side, for museum leaders, folks have to understand that not doing anything is riskier than than trying something and doing trainings and having conversations. And I think people want to change without changing anything. And you have to try to.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, you have to do different things to achieve different results. And so for me, it's not really about making all of these drastic changes all at once. I don't think museums and just general organizations are really good at making multiple changes, drastic ones, all at once. Try one thing and see how that goes, and then iterate on that. I think that's really what I want people to do, is try doing one thing, and then keep iterating. That is going to build up some resiliency for messing up, having to figure out exactly what went wrong, being accountable to that mistake, and then moving forward. That is what actually building authentic trust looks like in action. Trying something, messing up, being accountable for that thing, understanding that, and naming that, and moving forward. I think that's what I would want more museums to do and more leaders to do. And it doesn't have to be this vast change. It can be a really little, really little thing to try at first.
I think that definitely makes sense. Yeah. And it seems less daunting to take, one small step than a whole overturning of everything you've ever done.
Right.
All at once. Yeah.
There has to be some grace for change. Now, if you're not doing anything and you just want everything to be better, I don't think there needs to be any grace for you. But if you're actually putting forth effort to change the things that you can control in a timeline that actually makes sense for changing behavior, to changing practice and policy, I think there should be room for that level of growth.
So with that, I don't know if you've encountered this mentality or if you have advice for people who do, but how do you counteract this is the way we do things because this is the way that things have always been done mentality in trying to create more of a structural or organizational change? I know that we were just talking about smaller changes, but I think you were saying even at the beginning of the podcast that the hope is to have larger structural change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting question because a lot of the things that I work with in museums is actually deconstructing the way we do things around.
Yeah.
That is ultimately what organizational culture is. It's often all of the unseen rules.
I think that's even across the board, like not only in museums, but
It's
in
everywhere.
every organization, bureaucracy, everywhere. Yeah.
It's absolutely true. And I think that's also where I see this work isn't, museums aren't special in their uniqueness around this work. This work is being done across nonprofits, private sector, government, everywhere. And there are some foundational things that everybody needs to do. Now, museums are particularly special in the sense that they're often holders of objects, or they're able to kind of hold culture in a different sort of way. But in terms of how organizational culture actually exists, often it's the unseen things that you don't even know about until you get your hand slapped and you know, oh, that was against that particular rule that
some code,
wasn't around. So I think just naming that organizational culture exists within museums is a huge piece. And if I ever hear that's the way that we do things around here, I know that it actually can be deconstructed and made any other way. And it's often around our beliefs, our behaviors, and then our actual process to get to specific outcomes. Oftentimes, it's one or two people that hold that, kind of are holding tight to that culture that we really have to deconstruct. But without deconstructing that, unlearning some of the things and providing a vision and examples of a new way to do it, folks are really going to have a hard time. They're going to be challenged by trying something that they don't know is going to work. And so it's really, again, practicing doing a thing that's going to be the most helpful. Over time, you're going to say, okay, we're going to try this new process of hiring folks. It's blind hiring, where we redact their names and some of the specific, specific identifying factors for this person. We might try that once. And then in 2.5 years from now, we're going to try to revamp the whole hiring process altogether. So it's really starting from smaller things that are doable to larger projects. And you have to give yourself time. This is generational work. And so no one's going to be changing overnight. Structural racism didn't just this is 450 years old. We're not going to solve every single problem tomorrow.
That was part 1 of my interview with Andrew Plumley. Tune in next week for part 2. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, send this to another arts aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amped-lab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at ampedlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Tech in the Arts, or on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.